During the Cold War, the Soviet Union built entire cities that officially didn't exist. They weren't on maps, their names couldn't be written in letters, and the people who lived there were forbidden from telling outsiders where they were. But one of these secret cities was hiding something far more dangerous than even military research, because just outside of its borders, one of the worst nuclear disasters in history exposed thousands of people to radiation, and the Soviet government kept it secret for decades. The place at the center of this story was known as Ozyorsk, but during the Cold War it had a different name. Officially, it was referred to by a coded designation like Chelyabinsk 40, part of a system where secret towns were named after a nearby city, plus a number tied to a post office box, not a real address. It was established in 1947, in the rush after World War II, when the Soviet Union began constructing the first facilities for producing weapons-grade plutonium, the industrial backbone of its nuclear weapons program. This wasn't a normal Soviet city, it was a closed city built specifically to support secret military industrial work, particularly the nuclear program, and its very existence was treated as a state secret. Closed cities operated under strict security. Guards controlled checkpoints at the perimeter, entry required special permits, and movement in and out was tightly regulated. Many residents spent their entire lives inside the fences. The Soviet Union already regulated where people could live through its internal passport and registration system, but closed cities added an even stricter layer of control: surveillance, secrecy rules, and carefully screened residents. The city itself didn't appear on public maps, and even within the Soviet Union, most people weren't supposed to know that places like Chelyabinsk 40 existed. In exchange for this isolation, residents were given privileges that ordinary Soviet citizens rarely enjoyed. Closed cities often had better housing, well-stocked shops, higher wages, and stronger schools, incentives designed to attract and retain the scientists, engineers, and workers needed for the nuclear program. Ozyorsk, built around the Mayak plutonium complex, became one of the most famous examples of a Soviet closed city. Historian Kate Brown later described cities like it as Soviet plutopias, places where the people producing the atomic bomb lived with unusually high living standards, even as the surrounding landscape absorbed the environmental costs of that work. Inside the fences, life could feel strangely normal, and even quite comfortable by Soviet standards. Residents lived in modern apartment blocks, their children attended good schools, and the shops were stocked with goods that were often scarce elsewhere in the country. The city had parks, cinemas, sports facilities, and cultural clubs. For many residents, Chelyabinsk 40 felt less like a prison and more like a privileged scientific town, so long as you never tried to leave. But inside Mayak, the work was quite dangerous. The Soviet nuclear program had been built in extreme haste to catch up with the United States, and safety standards were often secondary to production targets. Massive amounts of radioactive waste were produced as plutonium was extracted from nuclear fuel, waste that had to be stored somewhere. Then, on September the 29th, 1957, disaster struck. A buried tank containing high-level radioactive waste overheated after a cooling system failure. The pressure built until the tank exploded. The blast released massive amounts of radiation material into the atmosphere. Fallout spread across the region in a long plume that later became known as the East Urals radioactive trace, contaminating an area roughly 300 kilometers long. The explosion is now considered one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. Today, it is ranked level 6 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, just below disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima. And yet, the Kyshtym disaster, as it later became known, remains far less famous than Chernobyl or Fukushima, largely because it spent decades hidden behind Soviet secrecy. Villages across the region were completely exposed. Thousands of people were evacuated, and some settlements were completely dismantled. Entire communities disappeared from the map. In many instances, residents weren't even told why they were being relocated, only that they had to leave immediately. Many people had already been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation before evacuations even began. And yet, the Soviet government refused to admit the disaster had even occurred. Cleanup operations were carried out in secrecy. Soldiers, workers, and even local residents were sent to help remove contaminated soil, demolish buildings, and bury radioactive debris, often with little understanding of the risks that they faced. And, for decades, the outside world had almost no verified information about what had happened near Mayak. Scattered reports appeared in Western media as early as 1958, but the details remained unclear. The Soviet state maintained strict secrecy around the site and the surrounding region. It wasn't until 1976 that the exiled Soviet biologist Zores Medvedev publicly described the accident, drawing international attention to a disaster that had been hidden behind fences and code names. Even then, Soviet authorities continued to deny the scale of the event. The government didn't officially acknowledge the accident until 1989, more than 30 years after it had occurred. By that time, another nuclear disaster, Chernobyl in 1986, had already forced the Soviet Union to confront the dangers of secrecy surrounding nuclear accidents. In some ways, the Kyshtym disaster had been an earlier warning of the same problem: a powerful nuclear state willing to hide catastrophic mistakes rather than admit them openly. Even after the Soviet Union finally acknowledged the disaster, the story of Mayak and its surrounding region was far from over. As archives slowly opened in the late Soviet and early post-Soviet years, researchers began piecing together what had happened around the plant, and the scale of the contamination that had spread across the southern Urals. Entire villages that had once existed along the contamination zone had all but vanished. Some had been evacuated, and others quietly dismantled and erased from maps. Meanwhile, life inside Ozyorsk continued. Today, the city still exists, with tens of thousands of residents living behind the same controlled entry points that once guarded one of the Soviet Union's most secret nuclear facilities. It remains part of Russia's network of closed administrative territorial formations now called Zatos, cities that are still restricted because they host sensitive military or nuclear industries. In other words, the system of closed cities created during the Cold War never completely disappeared. Some of them opened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but others, including Ozyorsk, remain places where entry is controlled, outsiders need permission to visit, and entire communities still live inside a perimeter built for secrecy. Even now, much of what happens inside these cities remains completely hidden from public view, which means the next chapter of their story may not be known until decades from now. For people living nearby, the disaster wasn't abstract. Many later recalled swimming in the local river, drinking its water, and fishing there as children, completely oblivious to the contamination. By the time the truth began to emerge decades later, mostly in the wake of Chernobyl, entire communities had already paid the price. Thanks for watching.